I'm just going to put up a PowerPoint and we will get started. Let's see. Okay. Now let's see, can everybody see that? Okay, we're in good shape. Sincere thanks to Sarah Clough. It's really been, it was exciting to hear from Sarah. We, as she said, have known each other for quite a few years. Her husband, Jeremy, did wonderful work for the Norman Rockwell Museum for many years. And Sarah even came to some of our events dressed up in costume, which was so wonderful. And also thanks to Thomas Groff. It's a great pleasure to be connected with the Albany Institute. So we're going to look at lots of pictures. And what we're actually going to do is talk about some of the most noted illustrators of the late 19th and 20th century, N.C. Wyeth, Maxfield Parrish, and Norman Rockwell, whose images created for books and popular periodicals of the past century continue to inspire us. As Sarah said, I am pleased to represent the Norman Rockwell Museum. You're seeing a picture of that here. And that is in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. We are dedicated to the art of illustration. We own about 850 original Norman Rockwells, as well as an extensive archive and the artist studio, which you're actually seeing Rockwell in his studio here on his Princess telephone. He received the first call that was not aided by an operator in Stockbridge, as I understand it. And his house is on the left, a white colonial that still stands in Stockbridge. The studio that you see on the right is now on the museum's grounds. We also hold about 25,000 works by other illustrators, as Sarah said, both historical and contemporary. And our exhibitions have traveled really throughout the world. You're seeing one here at the MFA in Houston. So we have really tried to raise awareness about the power of published art and the importance of this visual art form, which in some ways is so prominent, but in many ways really hidden in plain sight. Gifted artists have for centuries been sought to tell visual stories, whether to bear witness to the power of their patrons or reimagine a mythic past. In the mid-19th century, the advent of high-speed printing and the public's desire to witness events almost as they unfolded promoted a change, and the publishing industry replaced both church and state as the chief employer of artists. Illustration, a creation of the Industrial Revolution, became a viable and highly visible profession at the time when print media was the primary purveyor of entertainment, information, and commerce. Before the 1880s, noted periodical illustrators reluctantly accepted that their drawings and paintings would be transformed for better and or worse by skilled artisan engravers. And that is actually what you're seeing here, this beautiful Winslow Homer. This is actually not his hand. This is the hand of the engraver who translated his drawing. Wood engraving made wide circulation reproduction possible, but by the 1890s, this waning technology gave way to new methods of translation. Oh, sorry. Parrish, Maxfield Parish, of course, N.C. Wyeth, and Norman Rockwell reaped the benefits of these advances. For the first time, halftone and color printing captured the artist's own hand, revealing their brilliance and deficiencies while inspiring a distinct public preference for realistic narrative pictures. What remained through time, however, were the lessons of a perpetual line of artists whose approaches to the visual narrative were adapted and reinvented by each new generation along the way. My comments this afternoon will explore the unbreakable thread connecting Parrish, Wyeth, and Rockwell, whose artistic heritage connects us to the roots of European painting through their own revered teachers. At the heart of this story are Parrish's lush neoclassical fantasies, Wyeth's vibrant compositions and characters inspired by classic literature, and Rockwell's iconic humanistic portrayals for popular 20th century publications. To us, Rockwell said, illustration was an ennobling profession. That's part of the reason I went into illustration. It was a profession with a great tradition, a profession I could be proud of. Public engagement with the history of popular images has accelerated in the 21st century, and there is a growing awareness that illustration has mattered more in the modern period than has been properly recognized. We'll take a whirlwind tour of the exceptional careers of these three artists and explore the cultural forces that have inspired ongoing interest in their work. In today's digital age, it's difficult to imagine the role that magazines, books, and newspapers played when periodicals served as the primary source of information and entertainment. The ongoing focus of visual artists, filmmakers, and photographers, storytelling in pictures predates verbal language. At the end of the 19th century and during the early 20th decades of the 20th, books and periodicals were a lifeline to the larger world. When Rockwell's first cover for the Saturday Evening Post appeared in 1916, which is what you're seeing here, boy with baby carriage on the left, the Saturday Evening Post, the Post, Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, sorry, something just popped up on my screen, I apologize. Okay, got it. McCall's, Woman's Home Companion, and other leading journals had vast, loyal followings and were richly illustrated, enticing readers to purchase magazines and the products featured within them. Top publications boasted subscriptions in the millions and were shared among family and friends, bringing readership even higher. Illustrators working at the time were far more than picture makers. In high demand, they had a crucial role in affecting the cultural appetites of the day and in the development of an industry whose main purpose was to embrace aspiration and create the American dream. So you're seeing some wonderful advertisements by the artists we're talking about today. We think about them as narrative illustrators, but advertising paid better than editorial work. And so many of the top illustrators, including Parrish, Wyeth, and Rockwell, did quite a bit of advertising. In fact, Rockwell's, in terms of Rockwell's 4,000 known works or so, about a quarter of them were for advertising. Okay. America's most prominent 20th century illustrator, Norman Rockwell, was revered by his public and reviled by many in the art world, but his paintings were made to last. Created for the covers and pages of our nation's periodicals rather than the walls of galleries and museums, Rockwell's images were intimately understood by a vast and eager audience who saw the best in themselves reflected in his art and in the stories that he chose to tell. His intricate narratives imbued ordinary activities with a sense of historical importance, seizing the moment almost as it was about to fade. Replaced at the turn of a page by a succession of magazine issues and illustrations, he called the history of European art into play. Here you see a Rubens that inspired his portrait in Art Critic. And he employed classical painting methodology to weave contemporary tales inspired by everyday people and places. A cast of affable, exquisitely painted characters and details kept him and his audience engaged. and inspired belief by millions in the vision that he conceived and continued to refine. And I'll show you, sorry. These are some fun studies just to give you a brief sense of the level to which he would go for the creation of one illustration that would essentially be on the cover of a magazine for a week. On the left-hand side, you can see that he is working on his art critic painting, trying to decide what will go in each of the frames. And you'll notice that in the one on the right, he has changed the large frame to feature Dutch masters who are reacting to how close that young man is looking, because he realized that that would actually activate the scene. And here he uses his wife, Mary, as a model, using diaper cloth around her shoulders, which is what he used to blot his brushes. And here are some color studies focusing on different attitudes and expressions for the woman in the portrait. And here, surrounded by the many, many studies that he did just for this one post cover, which I'm actually happy to say is in our collection. In 1943, a Time magazine reporter noted that Rockwell constantly achieves the compromise between a love of realism and the tendency to idealize, which is one of the most deeply ingrained characteristics of the American people. Rockwell was witness to important modernist and postmodern art movements, from Impressionism and Cubism to Surrealism, abstract expressionism, and pop art. In choosing a path of illustration, he earned his reputation as one of America's preeminent visual communicators, helping to forge a sense of national identity through his work. He famously once commented that while he enjoyed receiving admiring letters from the public, he said, "I'd love it if the critics would notice me too." But in mid-century America, abstract art had successfully attracted collectors and critics whose passion for visceral, less readable artworks was in itself noteworthy. These seismic shifts in the art world also impacted the world of illustration, as many prominent practitioners championed more expressive, symbolic, and metaphoric approaches to their work. To step back a bit, Rockwell was born in New York City on February 3rd, 1984. The earliest evidence of his interest in art appears in his remembrance of his father copying illustrations from magazines in the evening after dinner, and you'll see one of them on the upper right there, which I think is really well done. Rockwell is actually seen here as the boy who's lower in the picture, and his older brother Jarvis is there on top. Even more permanently etched in Rockwell's memory were images evoked by English writer Charles Dickens. Read aloud in the evenings after dinner, Dickens' stories inspired Rockwell to portray the characters as he listened. Rockwell and Dickens read Dickens throughout his life, adopting the author's literary view and observing the world around him and everyday life for its rich narratives and characterizations. There's Rockwell on the right holding a frog. City life for Rockwell was upstaged by summer vacations the family enjoyed at upstate New York boarding house farms. The annual summer idyls ingrained a store of memories and emotions in Rockwell from which he would later draw for his work. They also influenced his permanent move to the country in 1939. As Dickens' stories had confirmed, the city felt overcrowded, polluted, and intrinsically less humanitarian. Rockwell began the full-time study of art after his sophomore year of high school at the National Academy School in New York City, and after, as he said, tedious and dull drawing from plaster casts 8 hours a day, He transferred to the Art Students League, where relationships between students and teachers felt more direct and vital. Tackling his assignments with a dedication that earned him the nickname the Deacon, Rockwell became one of the most promising students. With teacher Thomas Fogarty's recommendation, he gained entry to the New York publisher McBride, Nast and Company, which hired him to do 8 illustrations for an edition of C.H. Cloudy's Tell Me Why stories, and many assignments for children's magazines followed. It was not long before the editor of Boy Scouts Monthly, Boy's Life, asked Rockwell to illustrate a Boy Scout handbook. As a youth of just 19, Rockwell was retained as art director of Boy's Life, which was expanding to national circulation. Even in his early works, Rockwell's insistence on making each character a unique individual is clear. He would go on to create images for the Boy Scouts of America for 50 years. So you're actually seeing here on the screen a very early work on the left, and then a work from the 1940s on the right, which was actually inspired by the New England hurricane of 1938. And the Boy Scout artwork was tough for him in certain ways because there were so many requirements and he had to make a lot of changes. But he continued because he felt great appreciation for their support. In 1916, when Rockwell was 22, he submitted his work to the premier showcase for America's top illustrators, the Saturday Evening Post. At the time, he and his family were living in boarding houses in New Rochelle, an affluent suburb of New York that had more illustrators per capita than almost any place in the country. It was home to such illustration titans as Edward Penfield, art editor of Harper's Magazine, J.C. Leyendecker, the Post's top cover artist and illustrator for many prominent clothing companies, C. Coles Phillips, famous for The Fadeaway Girl, and in fact, Coles Phillips had a studio where Edward Hopper worked, and Hopper, of course, was an illustrator for 25 years and went on to be a painter. And Mead Schaefer, illustrator of fictional classics for Dodd, Mead and Company, and covers for the Post. Many of the artists met socially, shared models, critiqued each other's work, and even judged beauty contests. And I actually still find this amazing. In fact, Norman Rockwell was a judge at the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Miss America contests in 1922, 23, and 25. Yes, fun fact. And he shared the dais in Atlantic City, New Jersey with Coles Phillips, Howard Chandler Christie, and Dean Cornwell. And you'll see Rockwell on the left-hand side there, looking a little nervous, I think, but there he is. In the 1920s, as Rockwell's popularity soared, he typically spent 12 to 14 hours a day in the studio. Curtis Publishing became the primary purveyor of his illustrations in its 3 magazines, The Post, Ladies' Home Journal, and Country Gentleman. In the 1930s, a major influence on Rockwell's art came not from an artistic movement or style, but from using photography. The wear and tear and strain that working with living models placed on me was awful, he said. I would sit for 8 hours yelling, lift eyebrows, raise that arm a little, and make that smile bigger. I would carry all of these gestures out myself, and by the end of the day, I was so tired and nervous that I was ready to drop. Rockwell said he never got over the feeling that using photography to capture models' poses was cheating, and years passed before he publicly admitted to the use of photographic reference, which became an essential tool for deadline-driven illustrators at the time. In 1939, a move to Arlington, Vermont brought a whole new retinue of models. And after a 1943 fire destroyed his studio complete with costumes, references, and props, he reevaluated his choice of subjects as well. So what you're actually seeing here is Rockwell trying to call the fire department in the upper right. The line was dead, and so he had to physically drive his station wagon to get the firemen, who came eventually, but the studio was pretty much burned down by that time. So in good Rockwell fashion, they basically all had sandwiches down at the lower left and watched the smoldering flames that basically took everything from him at the time. Oh, sorry about that, going the wrong way. Okay. During World War II, distant from the activities of the war raging in Europe, Rockwell was challenged to record its effects on the servicemen and Americans at home. His only image of a soldier in battle, designed to stimulate ammunition production at munitions factories, featured a powerful machine gunner for the poster, "Let's give him enough and on time." But he wanted to do more for the effort and decided to illustrate Franklin D. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms ideals presented during the president's January 1941 address. Okay, there they are. Finding new ideas for paintings never came easily, but this was a greater challenge. While considering his approach, Rockwell by chance attended a town meeting where a Vermont neighbor was met with respect when he rose among his neighbors to voice an unpopular view. And that, of course, inspired freedom of speech, which you're seeing on the far left. That night, the artist awoke with the realization that he could best paint the Four Freedoms from the perspective of his own experiences, using everyday scenes to illuminate Roosevelt's abstract ideals. Rockwell's Four Freedoms were a phenomenal success, even receiving praise from his friend and fellow artist, Walt Disney, who especially liked freedom of worship. After their publication, the magazine received thousands of requests for reprints, and in April 1943, the Post and the US Department of Treasury announced a joint campaign to sell war bonds and stamps, capitalizing on Rockwell's vision. And here you're actually seeing Rockwell on the left. He is signing prints at Hecht's department store in Washington, D.C. And though the paintings traveled on to another 15 cities, he did not go with the tour. He couldn't take that much time from his schedule. So Rockwell's words and Roosevelt's words and Rockwell's imagery soon became inseparable in the public consciousness, with millions of reproductions bringing the Four Freedoms directly into American homes and workplaces. The paintings of World War II and the post-war period, more than any others, comprise the indelible images that forged Rockwell's identity as an American artist. Works like the Four Freedoms, Shuffleton's Barbershop, which you're seeing here, which we recently had on view from on loan from the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. And it's gone back to California now. And Saying Grace created the Rockwell brand. Though Rockwell's Post readers had always enjoyed the antics of his child models, they were now asked to see things in a new way. America and Rockwell's reflection of it were changing. The population swell of the baby boom, changing roles of women in society, racial strife, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons forced us to see our world and ourselves in a different light. As a perennial idealist, Rockwell didn't include the worries of the new generation in his work, but he did look more seriously at the subject of youth, depicting adolescents as more complex, dimensional people. Children were seen less at play and more at learning how to grow up ultimately to face the problems of a modern world and deal with issues that were previously, in Rockwell's word, quote, swept under the rug. In 1953, Rockwell and his wife Mary relocated from Arlington, Vermont to Massachusetts, which is where the museum is located, actually. And that is where Mary was being treated for depression at the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge. The small town of 2,000 people provided new faces and new inspirations for such pictures as Family Tree, which you see here, which trace the lineage of the, quote, all-American boy from a 16th century pirate and a Spanish princess captured on the Caribbean Sea. Much of Rockwell's work is inspired by autobiography, particularly this back to school cover published in September 1954 for the Post. And this was actually one of his most popular works, placing second after Saying Grace in a reader opinion poll. He said, "I once did a cover showing a father seeing his son off to college. That year, my 3 boys had gone away and I'd had an empty feeling. It took me a while to adjust without them. This poignancy was what I wanted to get across in the picture, but there was humor in it too. I put a funny kind of suit on the boy because he was a ranch boy leaving home for the first time. And his father was holding 2 hats, one the boy's beat up old rancher hat and the other his brand new hat. The boy was carrying a lunchbox all done up with a pink ribbon. I drew a collie dog with his head on the boy's lap. I got most of my fan letters about the dog. You see, the father couldn't show how he felt about the boys leaving. The dog did." At times struggling with his artistic identity and observing the cultural forces that relegated illustration to a lesser status, Rockwell commented, "My ability evidently lies in telling stories, and modern art doesn't go in for that kind of thing." Rockwell's 1961 painting, The Connoisseur, confronts the heated debate over high and low art and the dominance of abstract painting. While The Connoisseur juxtaposes the conservative with the avant-garde, it offers no clues to Rockwell's opinion of modern art, although he was a great fan. "You don't know what he's thinking," Rockwell said of the viewer, whose face he did not show. Separated from modern art by the deep roots of his academic training, he could embrace it only as an observer, as is true of the respectful connoisseur in the painting. Now, it's fun to watch him here borrowing Jackson Pollock's style. He's in his stocking feet. He is using commercial paint, though. Look at the tiny cans on the lower bottom of the picture. And he's literally trying to figure out how to make an abstract painting. Pollock, who was himself a skilled draftsman, noted that the modern artist is working with space and time and expressing his feelings rather than illustrating. And here you see Rockwell with his youngest son, Peter, who was an art student himself and who was trying to help him figure it out. After completing this work, perhaps with something to prove, Rockwell submitted a section of one of his studies to an exhibition at the Cooperstown Art Association, signing the canvas with an Italian signature. It took first prize for painting. And another abstract section of the study, signed with his middle name Percival, won honorable mention at the Berkshire Museum. So it's kind of fun. In 1963, due in part to editorial constraints at the Post, which was moving away from narrative illustration in its attempt to present itself as a modern publication, Rockwell made the decision to leave the magazine that had become synonymous with his art. Humor and pathos, traits that made his Post covers successful, were replaced by a direct, pared-down repertorial style, more appropriate for the magazine editorials that he would produce for Look. His first work for the publication was the one that you see here, The Problem We All Live With, an assertion on moral decency. Published in 1964, the painting was inspired by Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old African-American schoolgirl who was seen being escorted by 4 U.S. Marshals to her first day at an all-white school in New Orleans, a commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling outlawing racial segregation in America's public schools. Letters to the editor were a mix of praise and criticism, but irate opinions did not stop Rockwell from pursuing his course, intent as he was about correcting previous editorial prejudices that relegated people of color to be portrayed in service roles or not at all. This was kind of interesting. I was at my desk one day and I got a phone call from the curator at the White House, Obama's White House, President Obama's White House, and they requested to borrow the painting. So we did loan it for a period of months, and you're actually seeing him here with Ruby Bridges next to him, who is, I believe, now in her 60s, and our director, Lori Norton Moffat, as well. So that was a really wonderful moment for this painting and story. In 1965, Rockwell illustrated the murder of civil rights workers Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman in Mississippi. And in 1967, he chose children once again to illustrate desegregation in America's suburbs. Oh, sorry. For 6 decades, Rockwell inspired Americans by helping them to see the best in themselves. When he shifted his attention to significant social concerns, he faced an audience ready to receive his messages. In 1977, President Gerald Ford honored Rockwell with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest peacetime award, for having portrayed the American scene with unrivaled freshness and clarity, and with insight, optimism, and good humor. In 1978, the artist died at home at the age of 84, and he had in his later years struggled with emphysema, which was ultimately his cause of death. Now we move on to Maxfield Parrish. And when we speak about Rockwell, we almost always discuss his reflections on American life, but Parrish painted pictures that were inspired by fantasy. His technical wizardry and artistic sensibility combined to make paintings that are stunningly beautiful, reminding us of what it felt like to be a child, to dream and to imagine. Born in 1870 in Philadelphia to Stephen and Elizabeth Bancroft Parrish, Maxfield Parrish was descended from an English captain of a trading vessel who settled in America and received 3,000 acres of land where the city of Baltimore now stands. His own parents were cultured. His father was a landscape artist and encouraged his artistic talents. At the age of 2.5, he was presented with a large sketchbook embossed with his name on its cover, which his father filled with drawings for his son's amusement and instruction. And you're seeing some of those on the left-hand side. Stephen Parrish owned and operated a stationery store in Philadelphia, but sold it to devote his life to art. He is mostly known for his etchings of New England coastal scenes, such as the one that you see on the right. When Parrish was 14, he sailed with his parents to Europe and traveled for 2 years with some study in Paris, and was especially interested in the architecture of Europe. He continued to study with his father, and in 1888, he entered Haverford College, intent on becoming an architect. Leaving Haverford before graduating, he enrolled in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art in 1892, and he studied with these 2 amazing painters, Robert Bonner and Thomas Anschutz, in preparation for a career in art. Parrish spent summers with his father at his seaside studio and then at his father's home in Cornish, New Hampshire, called Northcote, which you see on the left. While auditing classes at the Drexel Institute in 1893, he met Lydia Austin, a painting instructor, and they married in 1895. After their marriage, Parrish sailed alone to Europe to spend the summer visiting salons and museums, and he studied paintings by the old masters, as well as recent developments in France, and met with many Americans studying in Paris. When he returned, he and his wife lived in an apartment in Philadelphia, but in 1894, he received his first major commission, which you see here, for Old Cape Cole, a mural for the Mask and Wig Club of the University of Pennsylvania. Parrish established a studio in Philadelphia, and his first magazine commission was for Harper's Bazaar, the Easter 1895 cover. Parrish's first book illustrations were for L. Frank Baum's Mother Goose in Prose in 1897, and coincidentally, this was also Baum's first published work. These included illustrations of Humpty Dumpty and the Man in the Moon, Little Bo Peep, Old King Cole, Jack Horner, and other Mother Goose characters. He made book and magazine illustrations until 1898, when he moved to New Hampshire, purchasing land in Plainfield near Cornish, and he began constructing the Oaks, a home of his own design. And sadly, this never became a museum. It actually went through private hands. Prolific in his work, Parrish began doing illustrations for the Century magazine in 1898, creating many works for the publication. And from 1904 to 1936, he contributed to Collier's and worked for all the Harper's publications as well. He also created illustrations for Ladies' Home Journal from 1896 to 1931, and for Life from 1899 to 1924. Parrish preferred the isolation and privacy of the country to concentrate on his work inspired by nature and the beauty of Vermont and New Hampshire. He was in constant demand for his work, and he never had an agent, with the exception of a short period of around 1920 for his advertising commissions. And in fact, Rockwell also never had an agent. When his children were young, Susan Lewin was hired to care for them, and she became Parrish's most frequently used model. He often portrayed her in both male and female roles. She ultimately became his assistant, helping with household chores like cooking, and high tea became a special event in the ritual. And there is Susan posing in a variety of roles. He had a tremendous costume collection, and she became a very important model for him. Parrish's expert figure drawing and design abilities are apparent in The Lantern Bearers, which features Lewin as a model, painted in 1908 and printed as a frontispiece for Collier's magazine in 1910. It includes clowns or pierrots, popular subjects used by the artist for a number of paintings set in his invented world. This painting captures a great sense of imagination, theatrical appeal, and the luminous paint that made Parrish's work so popular. He applied layers of pure pigment and varnish to create a brilliant depth of color. Figures dressed as clowns, hanging gold lanterns which glow against the Parrish blue night sky, while the 6 lanterns being handled by the clowns appear clearly. The nature of the 4 spheres in the distance is more ambiguous here. Despite the popularity of his work, in 1931, Parrish declared to the Associated Press, "I am done with girls on rocks." And he opted instead, from that time to 1960, to paint landscapes exclusively. Parrish advocated painting landscapes not in plein air or outdoors on location, as the Impressionists did, but in the studio. In retrospect, his argument reads almost like an abstractionist manifesto. Just a faithful portrait of a locality factual would never do. I feel sure all great landscape paintings are at least finished indoors, for there is no such thing as copying the more elusive qualities as light playing over a scene, the sense of air and space and color, distance, and the great dome of the sky, for these things last but for a moment anyway. Parrish's landscapes also gained a wide audience as illustrations for calendars published by Brown and Bigelow. In 1953, Parrish's wife Lydia died, and in 1960, Sue Lewin left Parrish's employ to marry her childhood sweetheart. In his later years, debilitating arthritis prevented him from painting, and he died at the age of 95, having left an indelible mark and an extensive body of work. Newell Converse Wyeth was born in Needham, Massachusetts. Growing up on a farm, he developed a deep love of nature, and his mother, the daughter of Swiss immigrants, encouraged his early artistic inclinations. His father, however, encouraged a more practical use of his talents, and young Converse attended the Mechanical Arts High School in Boston through the spring of 1899, concentrating on drafting. With his mother's support, he transferred to Massachusetts Normal Art School, and there, instructor Richard Agnew urged him toward illustration. On the advice of two friends, Wyeth decided to travel to Wilmington, Delaware in 1902 to join Howard Pyle's School of Art. And you see Pyle there in his studio on the left. Pyle was an inspired teacher and Wyeth an attentive pupil. The master emphasized the use of dramatic effects in painting and the importance of personal knowledge of one's subject, teachings Wyeth quickly assimilated and employed throughout his career. The astute young man recognized the value of Pyle's instruction, writing to his mother after his arrival that the composition lecture opened my eyes more than any talk I had ever heard. In less than 5 months, Wyeth successfully submitted a cover illustration to the Saturday Evening Post, following Pyle's maxim to paint only from experience. Wyeth made 3 trips between 1904 and 1906 to the American West. He spent much of these trips simply absorbing the Western experience, which allowed him to paint images that would place him among the top illustrators of his day. By 1907, Wyeth was heralded in Outing magazine as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, painter of American outdoor life. His pictures had appeared in many of the most popular magazines of the period, including Century, Harper's, Ladies' Home Journal, McClure's, and Scribner's. In 1906, Wyeth married Carolyn Brenneman Bacchius of Wilmington. The couple lived for a short time in the city, but moved in 1908 to Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. Chadds Ford had been the site of Pyle's summer school, and the rolling hills and sycamore trees of the Brandywine Valley had already exerted a profound influence on Wyeth, subduing his enthusiasm for the rough and tumble West. In 1911, the Wyeths purchased 18 acres of property in Chadds Ford, not far from a Revolutionary War battlefield. The proximity appeared to the artist's abiding love of history. Immediately, the Wyeths set about to build a house and studio, which you see here, and which is actually open to the public at the Brandywine River Museum. And they would raise 5 talented children on this property, and the valley landscape would become almost sacred to the displaced New Englander. In 1911, the publishing house of Charles Scribner and Sons engaged Wyeth to illustrate Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, his first commission in Scribner's popular series of classic stories. The 17 paintings that made up this set are masterpieces of American illustration. Their size and scale, unusual in illustration of the period, gave the paintings a heroic quality that is apparent even in greatly reduced reproduction. Within the set of illustrations, Wyeth brilliantly combined action and character study, enriching the story beyond the text. Complex compositions and his skillful use of intense light, contrasted with deep shadow, contribute to a dramatic tension in the paintings. These pictures made the Wyeth illustrated edition of Treasure Island a favorite for generations of readers. The success of Treasure Island ensured Wyeth a long career with Scribner's, illustrating in succeeding years many classic stories, including Kidnapped, Black Arrow, The Boy's King Arthur, The Mysterious Island, The Last of the Mohicans, The Deer Slayer, and The Yearling. He also created illustrations for other publishers for books like Robin Hood, Robinson Crusoe, Rip Van Winkle, Men of Concord, and others. Despite his fame as an illustrator, unlike Parrish and Rockwell, Wyeth yearned to be known as a painter. The distinction between painting and illustration was an important one, with illustration carrying a pejorative connotation that Wyeth felt keenly all his life. Even though the commissioned work earned him income to support his family, he tried to escape the confines of textual limitations with personal paintings that included landscapes, still lifes, and portraits. From lyrical landscapes in an impressionist style to powerful portraits of fishermen and people at work that recall the work of the American regionalist artists, Wyeth experimented throughout his career with a wide variety of subjects and styles, never truly attaining the personal satisfaction or public recognition that he sought. Wyeth also enjoyed a national reputation as a muralist. His earliest mural commissions, actually for Utica and New Jersey, have been destroyed, but in 1920 he created 2 Civil War battle scenes for the Missouri State Capitol and undertook a number of commissions in the 1920s and 30s. Many depict historical events and have allegorical themes. And what you're seeing here is a commission that he accepted in 1940 for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company in New York. And it was an ambitious scheme illustrating Pilgrim life. The second phase of this cycle was incomplete at his death and finished by his son Andrew and son-in-law John McCoy. Most of Wyeth's murals have survived, thankfully, but many are no longer at their original sites. Throughout his career, Wyeth created images for magazine advertisements and calendars. Several paintings commissioned by the Cream of Wheat Company in 1906 and 7 rank along with his best Western work. Later pictures advertised American Tobacco Company, Aunt Jemima, Blue Buckle overalls, Coca-Cola, General Electric, and Steinway. During both World Wars, he contributed patriotic images to government and private agencies, such as the American Red Cross. Tragically, N.C. Wyeth died at a railroad crossing in Chadds Ford in 1945 when an oncoming train hit his car. He had lived long enough to see his children excel in talents he nurtured. Nathaniel as an inventor, Henriette, Carolyn, and Andrew as painters, and Anne as a musician and composer. Andrew Wyeth's son James, also a painter, continues his grandfather's legacy. Interestingly, Parrish, Wyeth, and Rockwell were sought out by some of the same American corporations as artists who would signal the quality of their products. For example, all three created illustrations for Edison Mazda, a company registered by GE in 1909 for incandescent light bulbs. Parrish and Wyeth's illustrations are mythical or classical. So you see Parrish on the left, Wyeth in the middle, while Rockwell's generally focused on the utility of electricity for middle-class Americans, and his piece is on the right. For Fisk tires, Parrish painted a king being presented with a tire by pages, while Rockwell's hobo takes respite under a time to retire advertisement. And of course, in this case, Wyeth's Native Americans are outrun by a modern automobile. Created for a broad clientele over the course of almost a century, the art of Parrish, Wyeth, and Rockwell transcends its original purpose and continues to inspire a new generation of artists and admirers. Thank you so much for your time today, and I would be thrilled to take any comments or questions, and it's been so much fun to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to speak up. I think we probably have a nice sized group that we can probably just unmute and speak up, and we'll take turns and go around. If it starts to become hard to manage, we'll look at managing with something like the raise hand function or the chat box, and I'll interject a little bit if necessary, but we'll pass it on to you as the participants. If anyone has a question or comment for Stephanie, please feel free to speak up.
Sounds great. What do you think of the work of these three artists? Are you admirers? Anybody have a favorite? Oh, somebody might be unmuting. Let's see. Have some of you gotten to see the Wyeth exhibition at the Albany Institute? Dan, do you have, oh, Don Trogdy is here. My goodness. How are you?
I'm fine. It's
Don
good to see you.
Was a very close neighbor, as was his dad, who was an illustrator, neighbor of Rockwell's in Arlington, Vermont. And also Don was the owner of Breaking Home Ties.
That was a special time. We did lose it for about 30 years though, didn't we, Stephanie?
Yes, tucked behind an interesting false wall.
Yes.
It was it was an amazing story.
Did Rockwell interchange or meet with Parrish and Wyeth at, during their lives? Do you know?
You know, Don, not as far as I know. You know, there's evidence that he admired both of their work. We have in our archives and library materials that he collected of their work, reproductions of their work. But I'm not aware of any meeting of either of them, oddly, because they were contemporaneous. So you would think that there might have been a meeting, but not as far as I know.
Well, I can only imagine because, as you know, Rockwell was so busy. You know, he just didn't have time to go gallivanting across the country visiting.
That's true. I mean, they all were so busy, and you know, interestingly, they all lived in kind of rural environments. So maybe didn't get into, let's just say, the Society of Illustrators to hobnob in New York all the time.
Right.
That's actually, it's related to a question in the chat box too. You mentioned travel, Don. Someone, Thad Meyer in the chat box asked if you knew if Rockwell had visited Europe.
Yes, that's a really great question. Rockwell was a huge traveler. he found that the only way he could get away from his drawing board, because he was under constant deadline, was to literally go very far away. So starting in the 1920s, for inspiration, he traveled by boat, by ship to Europe. He actually visited museums, he even attended art classes. He really tried to gain inspiration from those trips. And he did continue to travel abroad throughout his life. Yeah, great question.
Since this was before email, and the illustrators are living rurally, how are they getting their work into, I'm assuming, Manhattan?
Yes, that is a great question. So in Rockwell's case, the Saturday Evening Post was located in Philadelphia. And the way that he got his originals there is he would, either his wife Mary would sometimes drive them, neighbors would sometimes drive them. Don, you know the people who sometimes drove things from Arlington, Vermont to Philadelphia.
That's right. The Edgertons lived next door, and literally their houses were 50 feet apart. And Mrs. Edgerton would be enlisted to take these paintings down to Philadelphia, which is so amazing in today's world. Think about how we package these paintings and how careful we are. They just put them under their arm and hightailed off to the train station. So different world.
That's right. And sometimes they were still wet when he delivered them, because of course they had to go through the photographic process. And sometimes, his wife Mary would literally just say, you're done, Norman, you got to stop now. Good question.
Thank you. Great presentation. Very interesting.
Thank you, Celie. Thank you for coming. I appreciate that. It is amazing the dedication of these artists to their professions. They literally worked all the time, from what I can tell.
Yes, I also thank you, Stephanie. And also we went over to see the exhibit in the Albany Institute, and it's fantastic.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So it was really, in fact, I'm sure we'll go back again a few times.
Yeah, the work is quite amazing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for visiting the exhibit, as well as participating in the program today. I'm going to put the website description for the Albany Institute's 3 generations of the Wyeth family of artists in the chat box. I just plugged it in right there in case anyone is curious about it and wants to see a little bit more of the description. We would love to have you come and visit us at the Albany.
It's a fabulous museum in all other ways. It's just a beautiful museum with so much to offer.
Did you have any particular favorites within the works that you showed, or the stories behind them today, Stephanie?
Well, I mean, I think, for me, the most interesting thing about these artists is the impact that they had on the public and the way the public sees and understands things. So, but I do, admittedly have a few favorites. Certainly Treasure Island is one of my favorites, but of Rockwell's work, I think certainly Breaking Home Ties, which is a wonderful painting, and maybe Saying Grace are my all-time favorites. But we're constantly presented with new surprises as we reevaluate these artists' work over time.
Absolutely. Looking at your slideshows and thinking about the current museum exhibitions, it was kind of fun to also see Norman Rockwell and other illustrators as judges in the Miss America contest, and the time frame relates to one of our other shows on view currently, actually, the fashionable frocks of the 1920s. So it was that 1922, I think, was it?
Yes. Yeah. Mhm.
Fits right up with the frocks that are on view. So it was fun seeing the art of fashion related to the illustrators too, and just tying it all together within what we have in our own galleries right now too.
Yeah, perfect timing. That's a great connection. Yes. And it's amazing to think about how famous those artists were, so that people actually knew them as celebrities. But the frocks sound amazing. I actually really look forward to seeing that.
Yeah, we look forward to hopefully having you on site sometime soon as well to show you
Thank you.
work in both exhibitions. Does anyone have any other questions for Stephanie?
This is kind of way off base, but the paintings that are at the Norman Rockwell Museum, I'm assuming, they stay there forever and ever unless, they're traveling, but I mean, they're owned by the Norman Rockwell Museum. The case of how the Berkshire Museum, they sold some Norman Rockwells, right?
Mhm.
Because they
did.
were, as I understand it, in desperate straits with finances, and this was either the Norman Rockwell paintings or the museum went. How does that work? And maybe it's a question for the Albany Institute also. Do boards decide that, or some paintings are never allowed to be sold, or how does that all work?
Well, I think, museums are considered to be stewards of the collections that they hold. And it has been generally agreed in the profession that artworks would be deaccessioned or sold only if the money is used from the sale to purchase additional works or other works that are more in keeping with the museum's mission. Because, I think that if museums were to just sell collections for the support of the institution, that really changes the nature of what it means to be a museum. During the pandemic, the Association of Art Museum Directors did make some adjustment to that tenet to basically say that if collections were to be sold, monies could be used to support collections more broadly. But generally regulations on that are fairly strict. And Thomas, I don't know if you would like to add to that at all. It's been an interesting subject in the museum field.
It certainly is and continues to be. And
yeah,
I certainly echo what you were saying, Stephanie, just in the field, when museums do sell collections, going back to specifically to the question, it is a process that usually it starts with staff looking to see if the artwork relates to the mission. Is it something that's a duplicate or very similar to another? We'll just use paintings because it's a lot easier just to keep to one subject. If you have two paintings, two landscapes, and they're both by the same artist and they're similar, and one you use a lot because it may reflect a lot of educational activities or something like that, and you might consider selling a second one, selling the second one. And the process is the staff looks at it, the board looks at it. At one point, the Albany Institute did sell furniture that was all had New England roots, if you will. They were made in New England. So we also brought in specialists in furniture to, make sure we all knew what we were looking at, that we didn't have some wonderful piece of furniture that, because we weren't familiar with New England furniture, we only have New York furniture, that we might have missed something. So, every museum will have a different sort of protocols for deaccessioning, and a lot of it has to do with the works that you're considering deaccessioning. And to the point of, for example, the furniture that we sold, then what we did is we acquired some New York pieces, and we used the name of the family that donated the artwork to us on the new acquisition. So you want to continue be respectful of the donors. And in our world, we were able to contact the donors and let them know what we were doing and why. So that was, let's just say it was not controversial. Deaccessioning can be controversial. There are a lot of different things. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
It's a
Okay.
great question. And if the protocols, as Thomas was describing, are followed, it should not be an issue. It's when they're not that it becomes very dramatic.
It can, it all depends. So it's always an interesting question, and I think if your board members think, oh, well, deaccessioning, well, that's helpful. It alleviates storage, but it is a process. It takes time and staff resources and financial resources. So it's done very carefully for the most part. Yeah.
Good question. Thank you, Celie.
And Stephanie mentioned the American Alliance of Museums that sets the standard for that most museums look to professionally. I just dropped a link in the chat if anyone was interested. They have quite a lot of information on their website about deaccessioning practices, including some articles related to some very recent issues that are like the Brooklyn Museum that's been in the news recently as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's great.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephanie. It was very informative. I love the selection of artwork you chose for to illustrate your talk today. It's great.
Thank
fun.
you so much. It was a great pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity. It was good to see everybody. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
everybody.
Stephanie.
Thank
Glad
you.
you're coming
Thank
back
you.
to the museum to see to the show a couple of times. I like that.
Absolutely.
And we'll all be at the Norman Rockwell Museum too, because we can cross that river and those borders pretty easily.
Exactly. We are neighbors. I love that.
Right. All right, everybody.
Well, thank
Have a
you all.
great day, everybody.
Thank you.
again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.